In this video, we're going to look at input monitoring and sampling. In order to use either of these functions, we need to connect an instrument, microphone, or turntable to the S2400 via the rear inputs, so let's look at those. You can see that there are two pairs of monoline inputs and two pairs of phono inputs. Input 1 and 2 and phono 1, left and right, can be run through analog anti-aliasing filter circuitry like classic machines did in the 1980s. So, if you want that retro sound, this is part of the equation, but we'll discuss the full technique during this video. Input 3 and 4 and phono 2, left and right, are not filtered. There is also a trim knob for the line inputs that doesn't affect the phono inputs. You can also sample over USB via the USB-B port only, and, by the way, the S2400 is capable of sending all of its channels over USB, which we will cover in another video. On the front panel, you can access the Input Monitor menu by pressing Shift and Input Monitor. Firstly, you have your analog input options, i.e. these guys. You can turn monitoring on or off and choose which input jacks to monitor from. Next, you can set the input gain multiplier. Broadly speaking, ×1 is for line level and ×10 or ×100 are for instrument level. The gain multipliers are applied before the gain amplifier that is controlled by the rear trim knob. Next, you can choose the input mix, left and right mixed in mono or stereo. You can set the output level, output jack, including headphones, and whether the output is sent to the USB mix if you're using one. Next, you have the options for the USB audio input, i.e. this guy. As with the analog inputs, this can be left and right mixed in mono or stereo. Next, you can set the output level and jack. Echo back to USB means that when monitoring USB input, that input signal is mixed into what the S2400 sends to USB output. Only USB to jacks means that while monitoring USB input, only the incoming USB signal is sent to the S2400 output jacks, not any track audio. Below this, we can choose whether or not to monitor whilst sampling and the required output level and output jacks for that. So let's sample something. To do this, hit Shift and Sample. I've connected a guitar to a stereo effects pedal and connected the pedal outputs to line inputs 1 and 2 on the back of the S2400. Remember, those are the inputs that have the analog anti-aliasing filters attached. In the top left, I can choose which inputs I'm sampling from, and so I'll select line 1-2 at 26 kHz and 12-bit for that lo-fi loveliness. Next, you can set the threshold over which the S2400 will begin sampling. You'll see that we can edit the samples after the fact, so this may or may not be necessary for you, but it's a handy function to automatically record only signals over a defined level. Note that decibels are exponential, and so most of the noticeable movement of the cursor is in the final 30 dB. I'm going to set my threshold to -49 dB to avoid triggering unwanted recording with hum or accidental string noises. Below this, I'll set the monitor mix to stereo and my gain multiplier to ×10 in conjunction with the trim knob on the rear. Note that you can see the input level displayed by the lights on the mute and solo keys, so you can make sure to avoid weak levels or distortion. Finally, you can set the sample time. Firstly, this can be max. The S2400 has 64 MB of sample RAM, and the max value depends upon the sample rate and bit depth and whether you're in mono or stereo. The exact figures are in the manual and the built-in help. Alternatively, sampling can have a fixed value from 2.5 seconds down to 100 milliseconds, or it can be set to bars or even specific note lengths. The lengths of these will be defined by the current time signature and tempo settings, so make sure those are correct. A note, you can hit the tempo button to quickly adjust the tempo without leaving the sample menu, although you will have to leave it to adjust the time signature or pattern length. I'm going to set my sample time to max because I'm going to record free and then edit afterwards. So I hit record/edit to arm recording, then trigger the recording by playing audio over the threshold I set up earlier, and I hit record/edit to end the recording, and the machine tells me that my sample is good, but you may get a different message if it is clipped, for example. After sampling, you will be greeted by the waveform editor that should be familiar to you, where you can edit your sample in the normal way. Run/stop plays the sample, and back or record/edit returns to the sampling menu. If you're happy with your sample, you can use Shift and Save to save it to a folder or project and assign it to a track. As mentioned earlier, there is a specific technique to get the full retro lo-fi sound. Firstly, you sample at 26 kHz and 12-bit using the filtered inputs, but secondly, you play the sample in fast and then pitch it back down afterwards whilst using the classic audio engine. If you didn't or couldn't play it in fast, there's a handy option in the Actions accordion of the track settings menu where you can resample the sound at a new pitch or as if it were a 33 RPM record played at 45 RPM. Finally, you activate the analog output filters in the effects section, which we'll discuss in more detail in a later video. But to make the point, here's a sample recorded in and played back at 48 kHz and 16-bit with no repitching or filtering, and then the same sample played back using the lo-fi technique just discussed. In the next video, we'll look at live looping.